In a recently published interview, Pope Leo XIV addressed the Latin Church's current liturgical disputes and the subject of the traditional Latin Mass. During the interview, he mentions, quote, abuse of the ordinary form of the liturgy as a potential driver of popularity of the extraordinary form, or the Latin Mass. So what exactly is this abuse that's taking place in the ordinary form of the Mass? And what about these abuses are actually driving people towards the extraordinary form of the Mass? Well, let's find out. Hello, and welcome to Saints and Skeptics, a podcast where we discuss common questions about the Catholic faith, the history of the Church, the lives of saints and church doctors. We're going to talk about theology, philosophy, and a whole lot more. My name is Michael Ryan. I'm so grateful that you've joined us today. On today's episode, we're going to talk about what Pope Leo has recently called abuses of the ordinary form of the Mass. So we're going to talk about what some of these abuses are, where they come from, why we are experiencing them in the first place, what we can do to help stop these abuses, if anything. This episode is admittedly slightly out of place because we're just getting ready to release an episode on what Vatican II was, as well as an episode on the Latin Mass, going into a lot of depth of what that is, where it comes from, what the history of it is, and everything like that. So both of those would be kind of helpful for this topic, but since this topic is in the news and it's very timely, and it was recently discussed by the Pope as well, it kind of skipped ahead in line. So with that being said, let's just take a look into what's going on here. So first, I guess it would probably be smart to know what Pope Leo actually said. So there was an interview that he did with Crux where they spoke to the Pope about a wide range of different issues. And one of the issues discussed was the Latin Mass, and as well as the current liturgical disputes surrounding the Latin Mass itself, right? So for those of you that don't know, let's just do a quick little story time here. The Latin Mass, which, as I think I mentioned before, it's also referred to as the Tridentine Mass or the extraordinary form of the Mass. This was, for a period of time at least, the only Mass. There wasn't any other Mass. After Vatican II occurred, there were some reforms that took place, which changed the Mass in a couple different ways, and in turn created what we know today as the ordinary form of the Mass. So the Latin Mass being the extraordinary form now, and the ordinary form being, the ordinary form. The Latin Mass, it was intended to be phased out over time, and for the most part it was, but recently, over the past 10 years, maybe even as far as 20 years, it's actually started to see a resurgence in the church, and it's now experiencing one of the largest amounts of growth ever. I hear both online and in my own personal Catholic circles that a lot of people are finding the faith for the first time ever or returning to the faith, young people in particular, and that a lot of them are seeking out the Latin Mass for one reason or another. So we have this semi-retired, semi-phased out form of the Mass that is continually gaining popularity. And then we have the current form of the Mass, which is the ordinary form. All right, so now back to the interview with Pope Leo, right? When asked about his views on the Latin Mass and kind of what's happening there, this is what he had to say. Quote, "There is another issue, which is also another hot button issue, with which I have already received a number of requests and letters about. The question about people always say the Latin Mass. Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem. Obviously, between the Tridentine Mass and the Vatican II Mass, which is the Mass of Paul VI, I'm not sure where that's going to go. It's obviously very complicated. I do know that part of the issue, unfortunately, has become, again, part of the process of polarization. People have used the liturgy as an excuse for advancing other topics. It's become a political tool, and that's very unfortunate. I think sometimes the, say, abuse of the liturgy, what we call the Vatican II Mass, was not helpful for people who were looking for a deeper experience of prayer, of contact with the mystery of faith that they seem to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. Again, we've become polarized so that instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrate the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do we really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? End quote. So that was a really long quote, but I think it's important. That's only a portion of what he said as well, but I think it's important to point all of that out. And this is the part that I really want to focus on here for this episode, so I'm actually going to reiterate this really quick. The Holy Father states, quote, I think sometimes the, say, abuse of the liturgy from what we call the Vatican II Mass was not helpful for people who were looking for a deeper experience of prayer, of contact with the mystery of faith that they seem to find in the celebration of the Tridentine Mass. Again, we've become polarized so that instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrate the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do we really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? End quote. So, what I believe the Pope is trying to say here is that if these, what he's calling abuses of the liturgy, weren't taking place, what we would see is that there really isn't that much of a difference between the post Vatican II liturgy and the Tridentine or the Latin Mass. And so when I first saw this interview, I was actually kind of shocked. I was like, hey, wait a minute, what abuses? I go to the ordinary form of the Mass pretty frequently. I don't notice any abuses, at least I don't know about them. So what is Pope Leo talking about here? Is something happening at Mass that shouldn't be, that I'm unaware of, and probably a lot of other people are unaware of? And then, typical me, that got me thinking, and I was looking for answers. And I was able to find multiple different examples, actually, of how the current ordinary form of the Mass is uh, not only not following the guidelines set out for it, but in many instances where if it was following those guidelines, it actually would much more closely resemble the Latin Mass, which is exactly what Pope Leo is talking about. So let's break these down. And by the way, this is no means exhaustive. I spent so many hours looking into this, and there is so much to see, which is one of the most wonderful things about being Catholic, is that you can study our faith for the entirety of the rest of your life and probably barely scratch the surface. But in situations like this, it's a little difficult because there's a lot going on, and I'm trying to be as, thorough as possible, but there's only so many things that I had the time to look into. And so this list that I'm going to give here, these examples, again, not exhaustive. It's just some of the examples that I was able to find in differences between what the documents of the church state the ordinary form of the Mass should look like and what it currently does. And speaking of those documents, there's two kind of main documents that speak on the ordinary form of the Mass and the guidelines on how it should be practiced. There's a lot more than just two. Like, as we were just discussing, there's a lot of documents out there, but these were the two that I found that were really good about giving detailed information about what the ordinary form of the Mass should look like. And names are in Latin, so let me go slow here, do my best not to butcher them. The first one is Sacrosanctum Concilium, and that was written in 1963. And this is Vatican II's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So that's kind of the first document that I was referencing a lot. The second document is Redemptionis Sacramentum, and that was published in 2004. And this was instruction by the Congregation for Divine Worship, specifically about the liturgy. And so using those, I was able to find a couple different topics or aspects, maybe you will, parts of the liturgy, the ordinary form, that seem to be, at least when looking at this document or these documents, not being practiced the way they could be or they should be, and could be causing a lot of confusion. Confusion, a word that would probably be used way too frequently in this episode, but I can just put a blanket statement out there that a lot of these things cause a lot of confusion, and I think you'll see why here in just a couple seconds. So the first topic is use of Latin. So you might recall from that really long quote from Pope Leo that I just read, but I'll read it again here, right? He says, quote, well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem, end quote. And it's funny because when I was looking at this, I found online that a lot of people took issue with this. They really didn't like the fact that he said, well, you can technically say it in Latin right now, because they were saying that either that just isn't true. They were basically saying Pope Leo is lying about that, or maybe I should say misinformed about that, or that it just sounded patronizing, right? And so they were like, well, what's the point of saying that? Like, that doesn't help us. So let's see what the actual church documents say about the use of Latin, specifically in the ordinary form of the Mass, right? The post-Vatican II form. So what I found out was that Latin is to be preserved and to be used, right? But that local vernacular may be used where helpful. I think we'll find this in discussing a lot of these topics, that there's a lot of may be used, can be done, might be acceptable, things like that. a lot of this is open to, your own interpretations. I shouldn't say your own. It's open to the interpretation of the bishop of your diocese. They're given a lot of leeway in how to interpret these documents, understandably so. It'd be very difficult for the Vatican and the Holy See to manage every single diocese across the entire world. So I get it. But by saying things like vernacular may be used where helpful, you'll see here in a little bit how that can kind of create some confusion, right? So in Sacrosanctum Concilium, they state, quote, particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites, end quote. And the Latin rites covers the entire Roman Catholic Church, so that we are still under the Latin rites. And so it's not that the ordinary form falls outside of the Latin rites, it falls inside of it. And so what they're saying in this document here is that, everything remaining equal, the use of Latin is to be preserved. It's to continue to be used, right? The bishop of the diocese, though, is allowed to decide to what extent Latin will be used versus what extent the local vernacular will be used, whether that's, English or Russian or whatever your local language is. The bishop is allowed to, basically decide how much of which will be used. And the same document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, says the following, quote, but since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass, the administration of the sacraments, or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of its employment may be extended. This will apply in the first place to the readings and the directives, and to some of the prayers and chants, according to the regulations on this matter, to be laid down separately in subsequent chapters, end quote. So they're basically saying the bishop of the diocese gets to decide what parts of the Mass they're going to use the local vernacular for versus using Latin. But one thing that I found really interesting was I actually have a really nice copy of the Roman Missal. And I was reading through this in the very beginning of the Roman Missal. They have tons of pages about how the liturgy is to be celebrated. And it's interesting to see that some areas of the ordinary form of the Mass are still specifically instructed to be said in Latin, even to this day. So this is from the Roman Missal, and mind you, this is the post-Vatican II Roman Missal. So this is after all of Vatican II took place, when they reprinted these Roman Missals to show how the liturgy should currently be celebrated in the ordinary form. This is what they say, quote, since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the profession of faith and the Lord's Prayer, end quote. So it was crazy to me to see that even to this very day, the Roman Missal is printed and published stating that in the ordinary form of the Mass, we are specifically instructed to use Latin. And as somebody who attends the ordinary form of the Mass, I don't think I've ever heard the profession of faith or the Lord's Prayer be said in Latin. Maybe the Lord's Prayer, maybe. But that would be so incredibly rare. It happens almost never, right? Go to Mass every single week, happens almost never. So it's very interesting to see, like, why is the Roman Missal stating that we should, not only that we can keep using Latin, but that we should use Latin, and that they're even willing to give specific parts of the Mass where it should be used, and it never is, right? I'll only speak for my local diocese, my local parish, but all the churches that I've been to in my local diocese, and I can say even when traveling, right, when going other places and going to Mass, whether that's on vacation, visiting family, etc., I don't ever see them using Latin, especially not for the profession of faith or the Lord's Prayer. So it's just kind of interesting to see that. So, Pope Leo wasn't off on this. He was 100% correct. Shocker, I know, right? The Pope is right. But Latin is not only allowed to be used in the ordinary form of the Mass, it's highly encouraged to be used. It's even intended to be used. Again, like we just said, going as far as having the current post-Vatican II Roman Missal stating that it should be used in at least some parts of the Mass. That's not saying it's got to be used all the time. That's not saying it will be used all the time. That's just saying that it can and even should be. So when the Pope says something like, well, you can say Mass in Latin right now, he's not wrong. And I get it that in some cases that might not be super helpful. And I can understand as well how it might be able to be seen as being patronizing, especially not if you don't know about what I'm discussing right here. But when you do know that not only can you say Mass in Latin in the ordinary form, but you kind of should at least say certain parts in Latin in the ordinary form. It makes a lot more sense what Pope Leo was trying to say. And this is a big difference between the Latin Mass and the ordinary form of the Mass, right? Or the Latin Mass, or the extraordinary form, as they call it, or the ordinary form, which is what we're currently doing at most parishes throughout most dioceses, right? Is one of the main differences is that the Latin Mass is in Latin, as you would probably guess from the name, and the ordinary form is not. And I think a lot of people, I've heard it in my own life, say that Vatican II changed that. Vatican II made it so that the Mass was no longer celebrated in Latin. What we see from the documents from Vatican II is that is actually not the case at all. The documents directly from Vatican II state particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. So do they say you can use the local vernacular? Absolutely. Do they say it's up to the bishop of the diocese? Absolutely. So is what's happening in the ordinary Mass like wrong or something? No, it's not. If the bishop of the diocese has decided that you can use the local vernacular, then so be it. That is correct, and they have the right to do that. My only point is that you can still use Latin, and that in some places you should still use Latin. And that's one of those things that could make that divide between the extraordinary form of the Mass and the ordinary form not as wide, because people could go to the ordinary form of the Mass and still see and experience some of the Latin that they do in the extraordinary form of the Mass. Okay, that's Latin. What about music? I hear a lot, again, in online and in my personal social circles, people complaining about the music at church. I think a lot of the secular style of music was brought about, like most of this we'll be discussing today, after Vatican II. So there was, the 70s and the 80s is when a lot of this change took place. And so a lot of the music was kind of music of that time. And one that I hear often being used as an example is the Eagle's Wings song. For those of you who attend Mass semi-frequently, I'm sure you've heard it. I Will Lift You Up on Eagle's Wings. That's one of those songs that a lot of people use as an example of like secular music that's just kind of, it just doesn't feel very reverent. It doesn't feel very holy. It doesn't feel very reverent. It doesn't feel like it's, time and place, basically, and it doesn't feel like it really belongs. And so when thinking about sacred music, I wanted to look at that as well. And when reading Sacrosanctum Concilium, they actually talk about that. And they mention that Gregorian chant has what they call pride of place. So here's a quote from that document. So it says, quote, "The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specifically suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services," end quote. Now, just to be clear, secular style music is allowed, right? It should be reverent, and it falls second to Gregorian chant because Gregorian chant, like we just discussed, is given pride of place. But just to be fair, secular style music is allowed. So Sacrosanctum Concilium says this, quote, "Other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action," end quote. So this is another one of those areas that I can completely understand would sow confusion among the faithful. I mean, it has to a degree to myself, and that's why I'm kind of looking into this, right? So when you go to some of these churches where maybe they have a piano, they have somebody playing guitar, they have somebody, playing drums or something like that, that's not to say that they're sacrilegious, right? That they're irreverent or something. I would imagine that they're doing their very best to worship God, to bring people together, to have a good and holy Mass as they possibly can. The issue, I think, arises with the fact that Gregorian chant is not done at all anymore, at least, again, from my experience, in regular, ordinary forms of the Mass. I think that there's a pretty understandable reason for this, which is that most people can't sing Gregorian chant. I can't sing at all, so I can't expect someone in the choir to be able to not only sing, but also to sing Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant is wonderful. I cannot state that enough. I would say when you're done listening to this episode, if you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you are, just type in Gregorian chant. You will find so much beautiful music. And if you've never heard it before live, I would try to find a place to hear it live because it sounds even better in person. But again, who's teaching that? who is going to classes where they're learning how to sing Gregorian chant? I imagine that's super rare nowadays. So I think this is one of the ones where, again, if Gregorian chant was used more frequently, as it's supposed to be per the guidelines of the ordinary form of the Mass, we wouldn't see as big of a difference between the ordinary form of the Mass and the extraordinary form of the Mass. Because my understanding is that Gregorian chant is used as frequently as possible in the Latin Rite. It's just not very common or not used at all in the ordinary form of the Mass. And in this case, I think there's a pretty good reason for that. It's hard to find people to sing Gregorian chant. I'm just pointing this out as another one of those things that, like the Pope is saying, there are ways that we could make these two forms of the liturgy a lot closer, this being one of them. Perhaps we start training choirs in Gregorian chant. Perhaps we find new musical directors that are capable of singing in Gregorian chant, or I should say chanting in Gregorian chant. And if we can't, like let's say your parish doesn't have anybody that's capable of doing that, maybe they can find someone. I don't know how common it is to be able to sing Gregorian chant. I imagine, sadly, as beautiful as it is, it's not very common at all anymore. But I do think there's something that could be done there in order to make it so that it's at least used some. It doesn't have to be used all the time, just like Latin. It could just be used occasionally, and it would make the Mass that much more special, that much more reverent. So, okay. Next, direction of the priest. So that would be orientation, right? There's there's two different options here. There's ad orientem, which means facing the altar, and versus populum, which is facing the people. What we know, well, I shouldn't say that. What I know, post Vatican II, going traditionally to the ordinary form of the Mass, is that the priest almost always faces the people, right? And this was a huge change from Vatican II between the Latin Rite and the ordinary form, because in the Latin Rite, they practice ad orientem, meaning facing the altar, right? So I wanted to know, well, what's the teaching on this? What direction should the priest be facing? And this is what I was able to find. Ad orientem, meaning facing the altar, is permitted and it's traditional. Although it does mention that versus populum, facing the people, is desirable where possible. That's in the current Roman Missal. So the Roman Missal states, just to sum that up, facing the people is desirable. That's what they want, and that's what they're instructing for this ordinary form of the liturgy. However, facing the altar is not only allowed, it is, but it's also seen as being the more traditional form of doing it. So it's not like they're like, if you have to, you can face the altar. No, what they're trying to say is that's allowed and that's traditional. And you can do that if that's what you wish. But the desirable way of doing it is facing the people where possible. There's no mention that I could find in any church document that says that ad orientem, facing the altar during the ordinary form of the Mass, was prohibited. I could be wrong about that, and if you have something that says that that's prohibited in the ordinary form, please send it to me, because I would love to read over that. But I did as much research as I could, and I couldn't find anywhere where they said you can't do that. Now, it's not done, at least, again, I've never seen it. I've never seen an ordinary form where the priest is facing the altar rather than facing the people. Although it doesn't seem like, it's prohibited or that they're not allowed to do it. It just seems like it doesn't happen. And I get it. If the Roman Missal states that facing the people is desirable where possible, then that makes sense. They're going to want to face the people because that's what it says. But anyway, I wanted to put that in there because a lot of people talk about the direction of the priest as well. And it's one of those things where they can technically face the altar if they wish during the ordinary form. Okay, reception of communion. This is a big one, right? I pulled another document for this one. The definitive modern document on this subject, reception of the communion, is called, here we go, Memorale Domini. Yeah, there we go. Memorale Domini. Man, I need to get better at my Latin. That's written by Pope Paul VI, and that was written in 1969. So this is the time of Vatican II, right? And in it, Pope Paul speaks at length about the action of receiving communion in the hand. And what he even does is he surveys other bishops to better understand what their thoughts on this issue were, which I thought was awesome. He's like, okay, time to ask the class, what does everybody think about this? And so My understanding is that he wrote to a wide range of bishops and asked them, there was 3 questions that he asked them. I don't have those questions here off the top of my head, but I know they were related to taking the Eucharist in the hand versus taking it in the mouth. And he was asking the bishops, what do you think is right? Which one do you think is more reverent? Which one do you think we should do, etc. Right? And they got back to him and they said, for the most part, I think it was 80 to 90% of the bishops that responded said that the Eucharist should be taken on the tongue, not on the hand. And so here is the verdict that Pope Paul VI wrote in his document, Memoriale Domini. There we go. Quote, therefore, taking into account the remarks and the advice of those whom the Holy Spirit has placed to rule over the churches, in view of the gravity of the matter and the force of the arguments put forward, the Holy Father has decided not to change the existing way of administering Holy Communion to the faithful. The Apostolic See, therefore, emphatically urges bishops, priests, and laity to obey carefully the law which is still valid and which has again been confirmed. It urges them to take account of the judgment given by the majority of Catholic bishops of the rite now in use in the liturgy of the common good of the Church. Where a contrary usage, that of placing Holy Communion on the hand, prevails, the Holy See, wishing to help them fulfill their task, often difficult as it is nowadays, lays on those conferences the task of weighing carefully whatever special circumstances may exist there, taking care to avoid any risk of lack of respect or of false opinions with regard to the Blessed Eucharist, and to avoid any other ill effects that may follow. End quote. So, what is he saying here? What is the Holy Father saying here? Well, he's saying a couple different things. First, he's saying, we surveyed the bishops, right? And this is what they came back with. He's saying that he's decided not to change the existing way of administering Holy Communion to the faithful, right? Which the existing way was on the tongue. And he's saying, we're not going to change that. He's also emphatically urging, which I thought was very strong terminology there, bishops, priests, and laity to obey carefully the law, which is still valid and which has again been confirmed. So he's stating, I am emphatically urging you, all of you, bishops, priests, laity, everyone, take the Eucharist on the tongue, right? That is the law which is still valid. We have just confirmed that again. And then what he says finally is that where taking the Eucharist on the hand is occurring, he understands that it's hard enough to have people remain faithful to, continue to fulfill your role as the bishop of a diocese of leading the people towards Christ. He understands how difficult that is. So he's saying, listen, if it's currently happening in your diocese or your country or wherever, I get it. What I'm asking you to do is, he says, weigh carefully whatever special circumstances may exist there. So he's saying, just think about it. Are you being respectful? Are you allowing there to be false opinions with regard to the Eucharist? You need to be careful and weigh carefully whatever's going on to make it so that you feel as though it's necessary to give Holy Communion on the hand versus on the tongue, like we have just said, is the correct way to do it. So obviously, I don't speak for the Pope. I'm paraphrasing and I'm trying to read into what he's saying there, but that's what I'm getting from his quote there. However, what he did do is he granted the bishops' conferences the ability to request an indult, right, which is like special permission. And they could only do this with Rome's approval, of course. But this indult would allow them to practice giving communion, giving the Eucharist out to the hand rather than to the mouth. And in the 1970s, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, they formally requested and then received an indult from the Holy See to allow communion in the hand as an optional practice. The indult permits communion in the hand as an exception to the normative practice, which is on the tongue. So again, you were allowed to ask for this special permission to give communion in the hand, although it was intended that this was supposed to be an exception to the norm and that it's optional, right? And again, the Holy Father was saying, you need to really weigh this carefully about why you want to do this. So he wants people to be able to govern their own diocese as they should, right? As the bishop of a diocese, you are given that responsibility and that right to govern them, right? And like I mentioned earlier, the Holy See, the Vatican, the Holy Father, they don't have the ability to manage all things at all times within the church. The church is too large. There's over 3 billion Catholics. So it's too much. So he's trying to say, bishops, You all need to decide yourself if you think that this is necessary. You need to weigh this carefully. And if you do think it's necessary, reach out to us here in Rome, request this indult. We will look into it. And if it's granted, so be it. And that's what happened in the US, and it was granted. One thing that I think is interesting is I was looking up this indult, and it never expires. So it goes on forever. You can take communion in the hand forever. However, the Pope does have the ability to cancel or reverse an indult whenever he wishes. So Pope Leo could technically be like, no more. I don't imagine that would ever happen, but my understanding is that it's possible. Also, there was a time around 300 or so AD, around that time, where taking the Eucharist in the hand was actually semi-common. I'm not going to say it was done all the time, A, because I wasn't there, and B, because I don't think that was the case. But it was done occasionally, semi-common, and although it was taken in the hand, it was done in a very reverent way, and it was done way different from how we do it today. So St. Cyril of Jerusalem, who's actually one of the fathers of the church, he writes, quote, "When you approach, do not come with your palm extended or your fingers spread, but make your left hand a throne for the right, since the latter is to receive the king and then receive the body of Christ in your cupped hand." End quote. So in this time, around St. Cyril's time, they did right hand over left hand, because what they would do is they would then consume the Eucharist directly from their right hand without touching it again. So it's not like they would do right hand over left. They would get the Eucharist in their right hand, and then they would use their left hand to pick it up and put it in their mouth. They didn't do that. They would get it in their right hand, and then they would bring their hands up to their mouth, and they would consume the Eucharist. Again, they would see it as a more reverent way of approaching this, which, to a degree, touching the body of Christ as little as possible does seem more reverent, at least in my opinion. So why did it change? That was another thing that I was like, okay, so it changed to left over right instead of right over left, like St. Cyril was saying. So why did it? Well, probably the craziest part of researching all of this for me is that it didn't. It didn't change. The official stance from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, as of today, meaning on their website today, it says this. They have a document called the Norms for the Distribution and Reception of Holy Communion under both kinds in the Diocese of the United States of America. It says simply, quote, "Holy Communion under the form of bread is offered to the communicant with the words, the body of Christ. The communicant may choose whether to receive the body of Christ in the hand or on the tongue. When receiving in the hand, the communicant should be guided by the words of Saint Cyril of Jerusalem. When you approach, take care not to do so with your hands stretched out and your fingers open or apart, but rather place your left hand as a throne beneath your right, as benefits one who is about to receive the king. Then receive him, taking care that nothing is lost." End quote. So they don't say that you should have your left hand over your right. They don't say that you should use your left hand to pick up the host from your right hand and consume it. They don't say if you should consume it directly from your right hand. They don't mention that. So we're touching again on some of the confusion that comes from these sort of things, right? However, what do they say, right? They explicitly state to follow the rule of St. Cyril, who explicitly states right over left, which, in theory would mean consuming from your right hand without touching it. Now, I did do more research on this, and the USCCB actually had another part of their website, a different page of their website, talking about receiving and distributing communion, again, separate from the one that I just mentioned. In it, they talk about the ability to use your left hand over your right or your right hand over your left. They're stating that they're not making a distinction. I believe the thought is that they're trying to say that whichever hand you are, so if you're right-handed, you would receive the host, the Eucharist, in your left hand, then you would use your right hand to consume it, to bring it up to your mouth and consume it. And then I think what they're also saying is if you're left-handed, they understand that that might be kind of wonky and make it so you would be more likely to perhaps drop the Eucharist or something like that. So in those cases, they're saying you can have your right over your left, then you would take your left hand, if you're left-handed, and use that to pick up the Eucharist and then consume it that way. So on one page of their website, they're stating follow St. Cyril, which specifically says right over left. On the other page of their website, they're stating you can do either one, whichever one works better for you, etc. And this is one of those ones where the reason I'm bringing this up is because twofold. One, when it comes to the hand thing, right? I have never, ever, I don't think, seen somebody do right over left and then take the Eucharist directly up to their mouth, which is the way that St. Cyril advised his followers in the early church to receive the Eucharist. I have on occasion seen people do right over left, but using their left hand to pick it up and put it in their mouth. Most likely they were left-handed, right? But this is just a moment of honesty here from me. There have been times since I'm a cradle Catholic where I have seen people consume the Eucharist, go up to receive communion, and they held their hands in a different way than I did. They didn't do left over right, which is what I was taught. And I thought those people must not be Catholic. Those people must not have even had their first communion. I've even had conversations with friends and family about what does the priest do when someone comes up and they have their right hand over their left. Clearly, they probably haven't had their first communion, and clearly they probably shouldn't be receiving the Eucharist, but the priest has to decide, kind of standing there, whether or not to give it to them. All of this to say, I was judging people without knowing, without really knowing what I was talking about, which happens, I think, to all of us more than we would like to admit. I was trying to act like I was the end-all be-all authority on how you receive the Eucharist by saying, oh, well, they didn't have their left hand over their right, so clearly they must not have had their first communion. The reality is that I couldn't have been more incorrect. Not only is it okay to have your right hand over your left, but in St. Cyril's time, and what is still taught today from the USCCB on their website, is that you should have your right hand over your left. So I think that's a really great lesson that I learned recently about maybe not being so judgmental and thinking that you are, all knowing. Only God is all knowing. And so I had no idea what I was talking about before researching this, and I was very surprised to see that. So that's kind of the first aspect of this that surprised me, is that there's multiple different ways to take the Eucharist in your hand that is currently allowed by the USCCB. But the other thing, the second part that's even more surprising to me and means even more, is that the definitive rule, the guidelines for the ordinary form of the Mass, is to take the Eucharist on your tongue. You don't have to worry about your hand posture and whether or not you're, left hand over right, right hand over left. What do we do with this? How do we do it? Do I pick it up and put it in my mouth? Do I just take my hand straight to my mouth? You don't have to worry about any of that if you do it the way it was meant to be done, the way that Pope Paul VI wrote the guidelines to have people accept Holy Communion. He wrote it that, what does he say? Let's see, what was that quote again? Okay, the Holy Father has decided not to change the existing way of administering Holy Community to the faithful. The Apostolic See therefore emphatically urges bishops, priests, and the laity to obey carefully the law which is still valid and which has again been confirmed, meaning taking the Eucharist on the tongue. This law, right, has never been changed. We have this indult that says that you can take communion in the hand and that, it's an optional practice. It's an exception to the norm, which is taking it on the tongue. But it was certainly never said that you can't take it on the tongue, that you shouldn't take it on the tongue, that the new norm is taking it in the hand. That's not the case at all. I hear many people in my life talking about how Vatican II made it so that you would take communion in the hand instead of on the tongue. And they would state that Vatican II, in that regard, was irreverent. They believe that it's irreverent to hold the body of Christ, that we're not worthy to do so. And so taking it on the tongue is the more reverent thing, and they claim that Vatican II got rid of that. It turns out that that's not the case at all. Pope Paul VI, who was incredibly involved with Vatican II, writes at the time of Vatican II to continue taking it on the tongue, the Eucharist, that is. So then why is it that almost no one, at least at the ordinary form of the Mass, takes the Eucharist on the tongue? I don't know. I tried to find out why that was. The only thing that I could find was that when the indult was granted in the 70s to allow it so that in the United States you could take the Eucharist in your hand, it spread very quickly. And I don't know that it was taught by either the bishops or the priests at the time to the laity. Listen, this is kind of an optional thing where you should continue taking it in the mouth, but you can technically do this if you want to. I don't know that it was phrased that way. It may have been phrased more of like, hey, you can do this now, right? Go ahead. I wasn't around during that time. I wasn't around during the 70s. So I don't really know what the discussion was like regarding that. But I think as time went on, it became more normal and more normal and more normal to the point where like almost everybody was doing it. Then a lot of those people that were born and raised around the 70s and 80s, they became CCD teachers, religious ed teachers, RCIA, OCIA teachers, right? And they began to instruct the next generation. And when they spoke about taking the Eucharist, I imagine that a lot of them taught the way that they were taught, which is that you can take it in the hand. That's the norm. That's what's normal. Even though taking it on the mouth is considered the norm, and that is still to this day the law that is meant to be followed, even in the ordinary form of the Mass, I think it was just easy to get confused and kind of lost in the shuffle. So this brings us back to the discussion of these abuses of the ordinary form of the Mass. In the Latin, the extraordinary form of the Mass, you kneel down at an altar rail and you take communion on the tongue. There is no taking it in the hand, from my understanding. In the ordinary form of the Mass, almost everyone takes it in the hand. Are you allowed to take it on the tongue? Absolutely. Do some people still do that? Absolutely. But it's much more common that people will just receive the Eucharist in the hand. So I think another way that we could bridge this gap here between the extraordinary or Latin form of the Mass and the ordinary form is instructing the laity, the populace, the people of the church, again, that taking the Eucharist on the tongue is the law. It is the preferred way. It is the way that you should be taking the Eucharist. And that if for some reason you need to receive it in the hand, it's optional. It's allowed, you can still do that, but that it's an exception to the norm. Not that it is the norm, because it isn't. It's the exception to the norm. So I guess maybe the best way to summarize that is that in the ordinary form, taking the Eucharist in the hand is the norm, but it's not supposed to be. From all the documents that I can see here, and from everything I was able to read, both from Rome and from the USCCB, taking the Eucharist on the tongue is meant to be the norm, yet it's not. So if we were to educate the people, I think that we would find that a lot more people would start taking it on the tongue, because I just don't think people know. And once they did, that would be another thing that would bring us closer to having these two different liturgies, the Tridentine Mass and the ordinary form, closer together. Okay. How about the role of the laity? We were just talking about them, right? About us, maybe I should say. Unless you're a priest or a deacon or a bishop or the Pope listening to this. How cool would that be? We've discussed I've mentioned this in past episodes, the role of the laity, what they're intended to do, and what their roles are, what they're allowed to do. But I wanted to read here from these documents and kind of give you a quote about what they're stating the guidelines should be in the ordinary form for laity. Right? And it says, quote, "Only out of true necessity is there to be recourse to the assistance of extraordinary ministers in the celebration of the liturgy. Such recourse is not intended for the sake of a fuller participation of the laity, but rather, by its very nature, is supplementary and provisional. Furthermore, when recourse is had out of necessity to the functions of extraordinary ministers, special urgent prayers of intercession should be multiplied, that the Lord may soon send a priest for the service of the community and raise up an abundance of vocations to sacred orders." End quote. What does that mean? Two things that I'm getting out of that. The first one is that the use of extraordinary ministers, which an extraordinary minister is someone, a lay person, who would be giving out the Eucharist. The use of extraordinary ministers is not supposed to be something that's common. It's can happen. They're not saying that it can't happen, just that it's meant to be supplementary or provisional, as they state in these guidelines here. They're also saying that if it's needed, you better be praying for vocations, because they want it to be done by an ordained minister. They want it to be done by a priest or perhaps a deacon, a bishop, etc. So what they're trying to state here is that extraordinary ministers are something that's like a fallback. You fall back on them if you need them, if you have to have them. But, that they want you to use a priest, a bishop, deacons, things like that. So not only are you not really encouraged to use Eucharistic ministers, extraordinary ministers, unless like strictly needed, which I think would be pretty rare, But you're also supposed to immediately begin praying for additional vocations so that the Eucharistic ministers aren't really needed in the first place. Now, being someone who's gone to the ordinary form of the Mass the majority of his life, I can tell you that there are almost always extraordinary ministers, Eucharistic ministers, right? Almost always. I cannot recall the last time that I went to the ordinary form of the Mass and there weren't extraordinary ministers. Now, I can understand, I think, where this comes from, because the guidelines here continue on to talk about, where it's needed and how there can be situations where extraordinary ministers might be needed, such as like you have a very large parish and one priest. Maybe you don't have a deacon, you don't have any other priests, the bishop is way too busy, right, or off somewhere else, can't be there for every Mass, understandably. So you're left with just one priest. That's it. In cases like that, when you've got a lot of people going to Mass and there's only one priest, that is where they're trying to state these extraordinary ministers can be used. Because if it was just the one priest, it would take forever for everyone to get through communion, and it probably just wouldn't work out, right? The problem is parishes where that's not the case. So, speaking personally, I've gone to multiple parishes where there's not a lot of people at Mass. Maybe it's the Vigil Mass. I see that happen relatively often, the Vigil Mass, or in early Sunday Mass. I see that too. So maybe like the 5 o'clock on a Saturday, or maybe like 7 a.m. on a Sunday. Both of those Masses, sometimes, at least by me, are not as full as the 9, 10, 11 Masses on a Sunday, or even the Sunday night Masses. Those are often popular with younger people as well. So the Vigil Mass on Saturday and the early morning Sunday Mass, oftentimes I see that there's not very many people there, and yet there's always extraordinary ministers. So this is a situation where the priest actually could take care of communion by himself, but doesn't. I've also been to parishes where there is a priest and a deacon, and there's still not a lot of people there. So not only does the priest have assistants, but there's also just not a large congregation. And so in cases like that, the two of them should be able to cover communion, and people wouldn't even be getting out that much later than they normally would because there's not that many people there. So then why doesn't this happen? Why is this the case that, we almost always, or at least I almost always see these extraordinary ministers? I have no clue. I really don't. I think for the most part, it is out of necessity because oftentimes parishes are underserved. There's not enough young men going into the priesthood to serve. So, and there's not enough deacons either. So they need them. They need someone to help, right? Oftentimes you'll see that there might be enough priests or deacons, etc., to give out the host, but not enough to give out the blood of Christ. So it's situations like that where I think in a lot of parishes, sadly, because there's just not enough ordained ministers, we need these extraordinary ministers, the laity, to be a part of it. I can give you another example, though, that was interesting to me is one of the parishes near me is served by the Dominicans, and they actually have a priory there. And so there's quite a few Dominicans. I believe last time I counted, there's either 6 or 7 Dominican priests at this specific location, and there's a deacon there as well. And yet, on all of their Masses, there are still extraordinary ministers. So even though they have, 7, 8 different ordained ministers that could be giving out the Eucharist, they almost always use extraordinary ministers, Eucharistic ministers as well. And this is something where this parish is massive. So again, I can understand that they're probably thinking to themselves, we got to get these people in and out, and we don't have time to do all this ourselves. But the option is there. The option is there for these individuals, just the ordained ministers, to give out the Eucharist by themselves. I have no idea why it doesn't happen. I can guess, like I've been doing, about things being busy or about keeping the pace and the flow, but the real reason of why they do it, I don't know. What I do know is that the guidelines given to us from Rome state that extraordinary ministers are supposed to be like a backup. They're only supposed to be used if strictly needed, which, in my opinion, from my experiences, would be relatively rare. At least in the parishes that I attend, right? And my experience could be way different from yours. So I'd love to hear what your experience is. But in the parishes that I attend, I don't think Eucharistic ministers would be needed very frequently, at least. Last thing that I wanted to talk about was the sign of peace. I thought this one was kind of just interesting, so I wanted to throw it in here. The sign of peace has been around from the beginning of time, or the beginning of the church, I should say. And it was originally actually the kiss of peace, which is pretty cool. But it's changed over the years. We're not kissing each other anymore in Mass. I mean, unless maybe it's your family or your wife or husband or whatever. But Redemptionis Sacramentum gave us a pretty cool quote regarding this that I wanted to read here. So, quote, "It is appropriate that each one give the sign of peace only to those who are nearest and in a sober manner. The priest may give the sign of peace to the ministers, but always remains within the sanctuary, so as not to disturb the celebration. He does likewise if, for a just reason, he wishes to extend the sign of peace to some few of the faithful. As regards to the sign to be exchanged, the manner is to be established by the conference of bishops in accordance with the dispositions and customs of the people, and their acts are subject to the recognition of the apostolic see." End quote. So what are they saying there? What they're saying is the sign of peace is meant to be given only to the people that are closest to you, very, very close to you, and it's meant to be done in a very sober, reverent manner. The priest can give the sign of peace to his ministers that are near him, like those on the altar, and he's even allowed to give it to people that are close, the faithful, the laity that are close to the altar, but he's not intended to be walking around or leaving the sanctuary or anything like that. And then they say that they leave it up to the conference of bishops to determine how to give, like the manner of giving the sign of peace. And the USCCB has decided that a handshake or a bow is what is customary. So what the USCCB is stating is it's not hugs, it's not kisses, it's not high fives, it's not holding your hands up and doing the peace sign with your fingers. It is a handshake or a bow. That is what they consider to be a sober, reverent manner of giving the sign of peace. This is another big difference between the Tridentine Mass and the ordinary form of the Mass, because oftentimes in the ordinary form, not only do I see people giving hugs, kisses, waving, high fives, holding their hands up and doing the peace sign and everything, right? I also see them leaving their pews, walking around, going to talk to other people, going to see their friends and shake their hands. It is almost sometimes seen as like a small time of talking, almost like people talk to each other. Hey, how are you? They'll shake hands, hug, things like that. And I want to be clear. It's great to have community. We want that community. I think that's oftentimes one of the biggest things that Protestants talk about Catholics negatively, is that we don't have a sense of community, that it's very, strict and rigid and people are kind of cold. So we don't want to be like that. But we're there for Mass. We're there to worship God. We're there to receive the Eucharist. We're there to be reverent. We're there to pray and to be holy. All of the community aspects can happen before Mass and they can happen after Mass. And they should. I hope that they do. I hope that every parish has tons of community events before and after Mass. But during Mass, I'm not so sure that it's supposed to be the time that you're doing this community building. And this, idea of being reverent and doing the sign of peace in a very sober manner is something that I had never heard of before. Something that my entire life, again, being a cradle Catholic, I've never experienced that. People are doing all sorts of stuff, and I thought that that was just normal, that that's what it is. And so this is just another example of a situation where the guidelines state one thing. They state to give the sign of peace only to those who are nearest to you and to do it in a very sober manner. And yet the practice of what's actually happening is much, much different from that. So a great example of another divide between the ordinary form and the extraordinary form of the Mass, where if this was kind of, fixed up, where if the priest just stood there for a few weekends in a row and he just said, hey, everybody, I just want to let you know during the sign of peace, we would ask you to only give the sign of peace to those who are nearest to you and to do so in a sober manner, such as a handshake or a bow. Please, refrain from walking around, getting out of your pew, giving hugs and high fives and things like that. Try to remain as reverent as possible. I think if that occurred just over the course of a few weeks, although some people might think it's very odd and might even give it some pushback, I do think at some point it would catch. And then that would just be another thing that would make it so that there's not so much of a divide between the, extraordinary form of the Mass and the ordinary form of the Mass. So what does all this mean? That was a lot, right? And that's not even everything. Like I said, there's so much more than that. But what does it all mean? What's the point? Why bring it up? Well, we spoke earlier about how people are returning to the faith or starting their journey to faith in record numbers, and praise God for that. Alleluia. But a lot of them want to attend the Latin Mass. And there's this liturgical divide that we have now, right? But why? Is that really necessary? No. Many people say it's because they want something more reverent. They want something more structured, more holy, more beautiful. And so we have these individuals who are trying to return to the faith, and they're looking for what the Latin Mass offers. And so as a church, we find ourselves with this sort of liturgical divide where many people love the ordinary form, and that's totally fine from them. And other people are flocking to the extraordinary form. And the point of my examples above is to show that there are a lot of things that are occurring in the celebration of the ordinary form of the Mass that maybe shouldn't be. And if these abuses, as Pope Leo calls them, were fixed and they weren't occurring, the idea that I have, at least, is that a lot of people would be more open to attending the ordinary form of the Mass, since the correction of these abuses would see these two forms, the ordinary and the extraordinary, looking more and more similar to each other. There would be very few differences between them if all of these things were taken care of. There wouldn't be at least massive differences. Some differences, of course, yes, but just not what we currently see. And that kind of makes me want to go back one final time to what Pope Leo said in his quote when he was, having that interview. He's saying, again, we've become polarized, so that instead of being able to say, well, if we celebrated the Vatican II liturgy in a proper way, do we really find that much difference between this experience and that experience? End quote. I think he's right. I don't think we would. I think that if the post-Vatican II liturgy, the ordinary form of the Mass, was celebrated the way it was intended to, I don't think we would find that there's a huge difference between the two forms of the Mass like we find today. Why is this occurring? Your guess is as good as mine. I gave you some ideas during this episode, but I'm really not entirely sure. I think there's a lot of things at work here. My only hope and my prayer is that as time moves forward, the ordinary form grows back to what it should be. It gets closer to the guidelines set for it, and it begins to represent what it should actually look like. So there you have it, right? A semi-random selection of different areas of the ordinary form of the Mass that are either not being practiced the way they should be, or in some cases are being ignored entirely. I believe that the Pope is correct in his assertion that if we actually practiced and celebrated the ordinary form of the Mass the way that it was intended to be celebrated, the way it was written to be celebrated, we would have much fewer people who are looking for the Latin Mass, and we would have many more people who would be greater satisfied with what the ordinary form of the Mass has to offer them. So thank you for joining me for this episode today. I really hope that you'll consider joining me again in the next episode. Like I mentioned earlier, next up are episodes on the Latin Mass, like I'm talking a deep dive on that if you're interested at all, as well as Vatican II. Another huge topic, deep dive on that one. Both of those are really good, so stay tuned for those episodes. Please remember that before I record these episodes, oftentimes just in my daily prayer, sometimes at night, I'm thinking about and praying for each of you that are listening to this show. I want all of you to be happy, to be healthy, to be safe, to be successful, and so I'm praying for that. And also, for those of you that don't currently or haven't in a while, please pray the Rosary. When I pray the Rosary, I'm often thinking of all of you that are listening to the show, and it's just a wonderful way to grow closer to Mary and through her to grow closer to her Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Lastly, the Lord is calling you, right? You might not hear it yet, but are you listening? Are you trying to hear his call? Because I promise you that it's there. To paraphrase wonderful scripture, knock and the door will be opened. Seek and you shall find. Make sure you're listening for the call because it's there. I'm your host, Michael Ryan. As always, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, and may he look upon you kindly and give you peace. I hope every one of you has a blessed day, and I will see you in the next episode.